Welcome back to News Talk. Governor Terry McAuliffe and the Democrats fell just short in their bid to take control of the Virginia State Senate. Republicans holding just enough seats in the upper chamber in this week's balloting to maintain full control of the legislature for the remainder of McAuliffe's time in Richmond. Here to sort out the results and what they mean, University of Mary Washington political science professor Stephen Farnsworth and Michael Pope, reporter for WAMU 88.5. Gentlemen, welcome. I know it was a long night, not a lot of sleep. Good to have you both here. As Governor McAuliffe, Stephen, wakes up this morning, he's no doubt disappointed that he couldn't create a divided assembly to help in the process of advancing the things he'd like to see happen over the course of his next 2 years in office. So disappointed, yes. Was he surprised, though, given the factors leading into the election?
Well, I think that this election result really speaks to how effectively the state has been gerrymandered. Almost every district is either overwhelmingly Democratic or overwhelmingly Republican in their loyalties. And so for most voters, the election was over before it began. And so I think McAuliffe understood that it was a bit of a challenge to try to take a seat away from the Republicans. But it really was something that when you're in politics, you try to win elections. You don't simply give up before the election starts. So uphill, yes, to be sure. But make no mistake about it. I mean, more money has been spent in this election cycle to less effect than perhaps anything except the investment in the burgundy and gold here in Washington.
Well, I thought you were going to say...
Or Metro, I guess, given the last segment.
I thought you were going to say, except for the paychecks of the consultants and the advertising people whose work was quite evident in the days leading up to the election. So, Michael, the Senate, the action was in the state Senate, where things were and remain quite close, because the House is overwhelmingly in Republican hands. But it was 21-19 in the Senate before. It'll be 21-19 in the Senate starting next year.
Yeah, total status quo. You know, all of the incumbents won, which is saying something, because some of them were actually in a bit of trouble. If you look at Jonathan Edwards' Senate seat down in Roanoke, there were lots of people that thought he might be in trouble. He was able to win re-election. Then there was Frank Wagner down in Virginia Beach. He was another incumbent some people had targeted as potentially being able to be defeated. He was able to hang on. And then Dick Black up here in Northern Virginia. There were lots of people that thought he might be vulnerable. He wasn't. He was reelected. So all the incumbents won. And then there were two open seats, a Republican seat down in Roanoke that remains in Republican hands, and the Democratic seat that was opened up here in Northern Virginia, that remains in Democratic hands. So what we've got is status quo.
Jeremy McPike defeating Manassas Mayor Hal Parrish for a seat that Democrat Chuck Colgan had held for quite some time. And McAuliffe was in Northern Virginia quite a bit to help McPike get across the finish line, and it worked.
Well, absolutely. I think that one of the things that you see in these election results, I mean, it isn't particularly good news for the Democrats. They wanted to take control of the Senate, and they didn't. But one of the areas in which there is some sign of hope for the Democrats in the future, they would find some consolation, perhaps, in some of the numbers that suggest that Democrats continue to do well in Northern Virginia, and the areas of Democratic advantage as you head west from Washington through Fairfax into Prince William and Loudoun. Those borders between where the Democrats tend to do pretty well and where the Republicans tend to do pretty well are actually moving westward. There were a couple of House of Delegates seats that flipped in Northern Virginia in the Loudoun, Western Fairfax area. There's a close race with respect to the black Senate race. The Democratic challenger there did reasonably well. So there are some things that Democrats might be able to point to as consolation on a otherwise dispiriting day.
So in terms of how the legislature works, Michael, and you spend a lot of time in Richmond when lawmakers are in session, if the House was never in doubt, the GOP had a huge majority before, and no one thought that was going to change as the result of this week's balloting. Why was it so important, at least rhetorically, for McAuliffe to get the Democrat to get the Senate to at least a tie so that Lieutenant Governor Northam could break ties if you still got the House as a hard and fast reality in solidly GOP hands?
Well, there's two things going on there. One, as you pointed out, is partly rhetoric. I mean, the governor wanted to talk about expanding Medicaid. He wanted to talk about gun control. The reality is, with the Republican-controlled House, that was really never much of a reality anyway. But there is an actual real sort of difference that actually happens in Richmond if the Democrats were able to take control of the Senate, which is they would have leverage when they do the budget. So they would have budget negotiators in the room. They would be able to cut deals. And so there was actually an advantage for the Democrats in taking control of the Senate. It wasn't just talk about medicating guns.
And it's so close now that if one person from the 21 were to resign or run for a different office,
which we have seen recently,
which we have seen, we'll see the money spigot open and a real battle royal, one would presume, for that to get that 20th seat to turn from blue to red, from red to blue, so that you again end up, as I said before, you end up with a tie, and the lieutenant governor ends up spending the majority of his time in the Senate chamber breaking ties. So who knows what the future will bring. Does this tell us anything about Governor McAuliffe's clout, his coattails, or the presumed battle we'll see for Virginia in 2016 when the two parties finally land on a nominee?
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. Whoever was going to have the better night last night is going to claim that this is a mandate, this is a tailwind going into 2016. Few states will be as competitive in the general election for president in terms of our electoral votes than Virginia. If you think of the top three, probably Virginia, along with Ohio and Florida, are going to be those three key battlegrounds to determine who the next president is. And so both parties wanted some sort of bragging rights. But it is important not to overstate these things. I mean, we're talking about an entirely different electorate that participates in a presidential election year. You're looking at a little less probably than 30% turnout when the numbers are actually added up for this election cycle. It'll be twice that or close to it when you talk about 2016. And so these are really separate things, but people like to bring them together if they can use it to make the case about how this purple is a little redder purple or a little bluer purple.
This was the classic off-year election. I mean, in Virginia, it seems like they're always voting for something that every November brings about an election of some kind. This, though, was the off year, and I'm guessing that as you went from polling place to polling place, you saw very few people.
Yeah, turnout, as Dr. Farnsworth was just saying, is probably a little less than 30%. That's a pretty low number. You know, I actually spent some time looking at the history of off-year elections. Odd-year elections actually dates back to the 1850s in Virginia, so this is not a recent phenomenon. And if you look at recent turnout numbers, the actual percentage of registered voters that show up on these what they call off-year elections, it has been going down rather significantly over the last 30 years. If you look at 1986, the turnout in this off-year election was like 60%. So now we're at less than 30%. So
which is not to say there isn't stuff at stake. When you're talking about the entire assembly, you're talking about things that matter.
Yeah.
Even if people don't focus on it every day, it strikes me foolish to sit out and give more power to your neighbor.
Yeah, you're talking about literally every seat in the General Assembly, all of the House members, all of the Senate. So that's, you know, everything from abortion to guns to civil rights to the budget to taxes to even tolls on 66.
What was the impact of all that talk of $17 tolls, potential, you know, hypothetical $17 tolls on I-66? We have about a minute left.
Yeah, it didn't seem to have much of an impact at all, to tell you the truth. There was a lot of concern among the Democrats that this was going to be the silver bullet for the Republicans in Northern Virginia. Those close House of Delegates seats that flipped from Republican to Democrat, the possibility the McPike campaign would be defeated on toll questions. These were the things that kept the Democrats up sleepless nights in those last few days before the election. But it seems pretty clear that there wasn't that much of an impact. It really didn't make all that much of a difference in terms of those Northern Virginia voters. It seemed like an effective strategy to try to make this case, even though it was not a compelling case when you actually look at how the process worked with that toll system. Most people who can use the system now for free would still be using it for free through the carpooling. It still is the kind of thing that sometimes you use in politics.
If it had been one of those things that came up in the last 72 hours or so before an election, grabbed people's attention and tilted the balance just a little, it would not have been the first time. Talking with the University of Mary Washington political science professor Stephen Farnsworth, Michael Pope, reporter for WAMU 88.5. A break. Back with more in a moment.